Hey there, how there, ho there, it's Jeff Gooder Diamond welcoming you to this week's version of World Cup Stories 2026 edition as we talk about the World Cup coming up in US, Canada, and Mexico. Of course, the first episode was the groups because of all the qualifications and the shockers and all that, and the 12 groups of four and giving my 2 cents about it. And then we talked about Mexico and their World Cup dreams and ambitions, and the fact that there was one fact that I found out, well, watching the 2022 World Cup was that Mexico had, every time Mexico made the World Cup past 1978 until 2022, they never failed to get out of the group stage, unlike a certain tartan country. Ooh, that'll be talked about later. But anyway, I talked about them. I talked about the Americans last week and how, the how they did at the World Cup. They had that 40-year gap between 1950 and 1990. Bet you didn't know that. Bet you that. Oh yeah, the Americans looked good at the World Cup. 1950, they did beat England in a shocker that a lot of people thought it was 10-1 England, not 1-0 US, but it was 1-0 US. And then, of course, the US had that streak between 1990 and 2026. They only missed one World Cup, 2018, and that was shocker, losing to Trinidad and Tobago, kind of karma for 1990. But today, obviously, we got to talk about the third co-host. There is a third co-host, people. It's not just Mexico and the United States. And of course, the simmering tensions in both countries. Yes, Canada has simmering political tensions and financial tensions too. Almost every country does nowadays. But anyway, it's all about this. It's all about Canada. It's all about doing this. And all about talking about Canada at the World Cup. Now, of course, talking about Canada, the World Cup is hard because this is only our third trip to the World Cup in '86 and 2022. But I will give you some qualification stuff and tell you how low Canada got in the whole qualification process. So strap yourselves in. It's Canada's time. Express yourself. You just can't go wrong now. Express yourself. They need to know it. Express yourselves. It's never wrong if you can do it all the time. Soccer brings the world in motion, and Canada's a co-host now. Soccer's got the world in motion. US and Mexico host too. Express yourself. It's one-on-one. Express yourself. 48 nations all. Express yourself. You can't go wrong, 'cause this might be the best World Cup ever. Soccer's got the world in motion. That I know. It has to be true. Soccer is big sport, and some stories are here for you. All right, so we're talking about the third co-host. And of course, we talked about Mexico and them hosting 2 World Cups and getting to 2 quarterfinals by process of being the host and getting the big easy draws, if you will, as almost every FIFA World Cup host minus South Africa and Qatar could attest to. And we talked about the Americans, how they actually were in the early days of the World Cup, and then they had that 4-decade drought. And then they hosted the World Cup in 1994, and it was successful. Now it's Canada's turn. So the runt of the group, if you will, of the three, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, especially FIFA World Cup processes. Both Mexico and the United States have made double-digit World Cups. Canada, by comparison, have only made 3. And this time, 2026, was only because they're co-hosts. So here's how it went down. So Canada decided to try for the first time to make the World Cup in 1958. They played 4 games, won 2, could have done better, but they failed miserably in the World Cup qualification process. They didn't even try in 62 and 66. And in 1974, they did decently in qualification, but did not do it. 1978 was the first major trip chance. There was one spot for the CONCACAF. At the time, there were only 16 nations in the World Cup. And all that, top two moved on to the quarterfinals. And because of the small number, and since CONCACAF basically was just Mexico and practically no one else, well, El Salvador qualified in 1970 from CONCACAF, that's the North American League, and all that. Due to the fact Mexico was the hosts, like, you know, that was why. In 1977, Canada would take on Mexico, Haiti, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Suriname for one spot in the big boy thing. And no surprise, Mexico got it with 10 points, and then in 1978 they failed to get out of the group stage, which actually was the last time Mexico failed till 2022 when they entered the World Cup. And as I said, 1990 they were actually booted from the World Cup because of their overage players at the Olympics for Olympic qualifying. And that kind of may have led the Americans to make it 1990. So yeah, so Canada tried their best, but they couldn't do well. In 1982, they had lots of ties in qualification, but didn't make it through. I think they were close, weren't they? In 1982? Yeah, that's my thing. In 1982, I think they were close. I have a funny feeling they were close in 1982 to qualifying. So yeah, there were six teams in the 1982 World Cup CONCACAF qualifier. That the top two moved on to the World Cup and all that, because now that the tournament expanded from 16 to 24 nations, Canada in 1982 had a chance. There were two CONCACAF spots, or North American spots. Unfortunately for Canada, and even for Mexico, of all teams, they failed. Honduras and El Salvador, known for having the soccer war in 1969, actually qualified. Canada tried their best. I mean, they were close. But yeah, it was weird to see Mexico fall flat. Mexico lost to El Salvador when they should have won in El Salvador. I mean, like, I was shocked. Canada tied Mexico even. So Honduras won the CONCACAF thing, and El Salvador qualified too. So Canada wasn't really doing that much. And then in 1986, CONCACAF got 2 places. Yeah, so CONCACAF got 2 places. So North America could send 2 teams. Mexico was hosting in 1986, so obviously they were going to get it. Well, actually, Mexico got lucky because Colombia was about to host that World Cup in 1986, but they had an earthquake. So did Mexico, but Mexico's was not that bad. So 16 nations would compete in a thing to qualify for the CONCACAF Championship. All that. So Canada took on Jamaica, but Jamaica withdrew, so Canada got to move on in the whole thing. The United States easily beat Netherlands, Antilles, El Salvador won. Costa Rica got the win with a walkover win over Barbados. Honduras beat Panama, which was hard to impress. Haiti won, Trinidad, and Suriname won. So it was off to the CONCACAF Championship of 1985. As I gotta look at my stats here. So yeah, 1985. So 9 nations would compete in 3 three-team groups. The top team in each of the 3 groups would play each other in a double round robin for that last North American spot. Honduras won Group 1 over El Salvador and Suriname. It's shocking that Honduras and El Salvador were in the same group, but Honduras beats their neighbors, El Salvador. Canada was in a group with Guatemala and Haiti. Well, Haiti was no hard task. Canada beat Haiti 2-0 in Victoria, British Columbia. Then they beat Guatemala 2-1 in Victoria. They went to Guatemala, tied them, and then went to Haiti and won 2-0. No matter what Guatemala did against Haiti, Canada was going to move on. The Americans were paired up with Costa Rica and Trinidad and Tobago. Strangely, in 1990, those 3 countries would bump into each other. But Costa Rica and Trinidad would win a trip to the World Cup thanks to Mexico's stupidity. The United States as well, and Trinidad got bit. It's funny to see that the Americans couldn't even beat Costa Rica. And in the final round, it was Canada, Honduras, Costa Rica. Costa Rica and Honduras tied 2-2. And then August 17, 1985, Canada tied Costa Rica 1-1 in Toronto at Varsity Stadium. And then Canada went to Honduras 8 days later and beat them 1-0. Then they went to Costa Rica a week later and tied them 0-0. Honduras beat Costa Rica 3-1 to set up a massive game between them and Canada in St. John's, Newfoundland. The story of how that game happened, you got to see it to believe it. So anyway, Canada and Honduras were playing, and so Canada decided to put the game in St. John's because they wanted to have both coasts, be represented. The west coast of Victoria and the east coast of lovely Toronto. And Newfoundland. The problem was because of Canada being so expansive, it was the second largest landmass behind the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union would dissolve and Russia be the main one, Russia still had more square space than Canada. We're still number 2. But the fact is that, Honduran fans actually got bit because the qualifying game was in St. John's, Newfoundland. But there's a St. John without the apostrophe S in New Brunswick. So basically the Honduras fans went to the wrong province and had to sit and watch the game of the bar. Fortunately, though, there were some Honduran fans that made it to St. John's, and being stereotypically Canadian as we are, we let them pass. And they watched. Canada got a big goal by Igor Frolik. Canada just needed the tie to beat Honduras, win the CONCACAF championship, and give that second spot to Mexico. And we did. And so we did. So anyway, it was huge and all that. So Canada got to go to the World Cup in 1986. So we're happy as we can be and all that. A few injuries did hurt Canada's qualifying thing. So in Mexico, they would play 2 games in Irapuato and 1 in Lyon. L-E-O-N. Not Lyon as in France, L-Y-O-N. Canada would play France in the first game. Canada got actually drawn into a very tough group. The French were the defending Euro champions. So Canada was about to get trounced. Everyone was thinking Canada would get trounced in the first game. On June 1st, at 4 Central Time, that means 5 Eastern Time, Canadian fans got to watch it on, I think it was CBC, who hosted the World Cup. Yep. And France kept having scoring chances. They had like 6 or 7 scoring chances, and you thought if they just convert on a few, Canada would get their butts handed them. Well, Canada lost to France 1-0. France basically made messes of all their chances, except for Jean-Marie Papin scoring goals. So yeah, Papin scored, and Canada got out of there with a 1-0 loss to the French. 5 days later, on June 6th, at 1 Eastern Time, it was Canada versus Hungary. Hungary were no slouches. The magical Magyars of the 1954 almost won the World Cup, but West Germany beat them. But Hungary were no slouches. They beat Canada 2-0. There were a couple of massive scoring chances, including one seemingly cross-field pass that all the guy had to do was tap it in the net. No, he didn't. Unfortunately, though, Hungary won the game 2-0. And then Canada would take on the Soviets, who were a decent team in themselves. Of course, Lev Yashin, the Black Spider, one of the best goalies ever. Well, not at the time. Well, not in 1986, but So at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Canada got beaten up by the Soviets 2-0. So Canada were 3-out. They lost all 3 games. They had a goal differential of -5. They gave up 5 goals. They scored 0. Canada could not score 1 goal to save their freaking lives. What's even worse was that Canada had a -5 goal differential. What's even worse was that Uruguay, even though they got trounced by Denmark, still made it to the knockout stages, 16 teams out of 24, due to the fact they were 3rd, and they basically booted Scotland through, and Uruguay had a -6 goal differential. And the good news, in a sense, was that Canada at least could hold their heads up high, holding the European champs to 1 goal, even though they gave up 2 to Hungary and the Soviets. So Canada in 1990 didn't do well. Then 1994 came in. North America was given 2.25 places. The Americans qualified automatically. And then there was 1.25 spot. Whoever won the last stage of CONCACAF qualifying would qualify too. But whoever took second would be in an interconfederational playoff and all that. So Canada didn't enter anything until Group B, when they faced El Salvador, Jamaica, and Bermuda. They needed to be top 2, and they were. El Salvador won the group, but Canada beat Jamaica and Bermuda for second place, which was huge. So, yeah, they had to play hard. And then in the final round, there was a double round robin. So you had to face 2 matches. Yeah, you had to face each other twice. It was Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras. Cal Surprise. Mexico, who almost make the World Cup. El Salvador and Honduras, the soccer war guys at each other's throats. Canada, thankfully, were 3-2-1. 3-2-1, boom. El Salvador could only win a few. Honduras could only score once. So Canada took second. Mexico was almost unstoppable. There were 5-1. They lost to El Salvador first qualification match, but they won the next 5. Canada tied Honduras April 93 2-2. And then they hosted El Salvador in Burnaby at Swangard and beat them 2-0. They beat Honduras 3-1 at Swangard the next week. So they were looking decent. But then they went to Mexico, Azteca. Almost every country falters at Azteca, and they did 4-0. Canada then went to El Salvador, beat them 2-1. Couldn't beat Mexico on home turf in Toronto, which would have been big. They scored first, but they gave up 2 straight goals. Canada would then have to face Australia in a CONCACAF Oceania playoff. It was 2-1 Canada winning the game on home turf, but they lost 2-1 in Australia. Extra time happened, and after extra time, it was 3-3, so they needed to go to penalty kicks. And no, the away goals rule didn't work because both Australia and Canada scored once on the road. So no one qualified for there. So, yeah. So it went to penalties. Australia crushed Canada in penalties 4-1. So Australia was going to the World Cup. Not so fast. Canada could take solace of the fact that Australia did not make the World Cup because Australia now had to move to another stage of playoff. They would face one of the South American runners up in the groups. And wouldn't you know it? It was Argentina. Yeah, it was Argentina who would take down Australia. So Canada kind of dodged a bullet, but they still tried. 98, Canada had a bit of a chance. You know, so there were 3 teams that could qualify for the World Cup. Canada needed to be top 3 in the final 6, alongside Mexico, U.S., Jamaica, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. Canada, unfortunately, were terrible. They only scored 6 points in the qualification. Mexico, U.S., and Jamaica all went to the World Cup. So basically, Canada could not go to France. Canada then stumbled. By 2010 was when they really had some problems and all that. So Canada would be in a group. Canada beat St. Vincent in 2010 to move on. But Canada, their problems were huge. In Group 2 in 2010, they were paired up with Honduras, Mexico, and Jamaica. They needed to be top 2. Well, Canada got 2 points, that is. They had 2 ties. One against Mexico, one against Jamaica. But other than that, they were helpless and hopeless. 2014, 2014, Canada won their little group D with Puerto Rico, St. Kitts, and St. Lucia. Moved on to round 3 and fell flat. Canada actually was in the group of Honduras, Panama, and Cuba. Needed to be top 2 to move on to the final round of World Cup qualification for 2014 in North America. But wouldn't you know it, Canada laid a massive goose egg to Honduras, losing 8-1. Honduras needed that win. Canada needed a tie to move on to the final 6. They failed miserably. They lost 8-1. U.S., Costa Rica, and Honduras would get to the World Cup through the 2014 qualification thing. Mexico would go to the Interconfederational playoffs and beat the Oceania team, New Zealand, quite easily. So, yeah, Canada could have put up a fight. Yeah, that 8-1 loss to Honduras was a low blow to Canada, in a sense, because Canada went down to like 70th in the thing. So, anyway, Canada in 2018 had to qualify through the second round of CONCACAF qualifying, had to beat Dominica. And then they beat Belize in the third round. So in the fourth round, they would be paired up with Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador. Same as 94. They needed to be top 2. Canada failed by 1 freaking point to Honduras. Honduras beating Canada by 1 point. That was stupid. Mexico was crushing it, but Canada could not even take care of Honduras. So that just blew chunks and all that. Honduras would take 4th and go to the Confederational playoffs against Australia and lose to the Aussies. So there's some sick consolation. Mexico, Costa Rica, and Panama qualified. Of course, that was when the Americans made a massive boo-boo in Trinidad and Tobago. Team that definitely wasn't going to make any noise in qualification. But the Americans lost, and results even got Honduras ahead of them to face Australia. So the Americans could have faced Australia and probably won. So Canada was very low and all that. A lot of people said that Canada was basically screwed and all that. So then what happened was Canada would be unfortunately paired up in the first round of qualification for 2022. Paired up with Suriname, Bermuda, Aruba, and Cayman Islands. And obviously only one team could move on to the next stage. So Canada thankfully won all 4 games against those 4 nations, Suriname, Bermuda, Aruba, and Cayman Islands, giving up 1 goal. That was to Bermuda, if you must know. So thankfully they went through, and then in the second round, well, those 6 group winners were playing 3 home and away ties to get to the last stage, the final stage of CONCACAF. Canada took care of Haiti quite easily 4-0. Them, El Salvador, and Panama would move on. Alongside them, they would have to deal with Mexico, United States, Costa Rica, Jamaica, and Honduras. So the tournament was expanded to 8 teams. So Canada would have to face the 7 countries, both home and away. And wouldn't you know it, Canada started off kind of rough. A 0-0 tie with Jamaica. I remember complaining about that on Facebook, saying, we tied Jamaica, we should be freaking beating them. And then people said, Jamaica's a good team. No, probably then, but not now. Little did I know that Canada was going to make some moves. One crazy weekend, one crazy, like 4-day period, Canada would host Mexico and the United States. I think, right? Hold on, I'm probably wrong. Let's see. Well, I know Canada played. Well, Canada in October went to Mexico and Azteca and actually shockingly tied Mexico, which was unusual. So yeah, Canada in 2022. They tied Honduras 1-1 on home turf at BMO, although they should have beaten those guys. Then they went to Nashville to take on the Americans, and Kyle Larin tied the game, and it was 1-1, so we tied them. We crushed El Salvador 3-0. We take down Mexico we tie them. We go to Jamaica and can't beat those guys. Then we host Panama October in Toronto, win 4-1. Panama, my butt. You know, the 2018 thing. And then Canada got to host Costa Rica and Mexico in Edmonton in frigid conditions. It actually snowed during the game against Mexico. Canada beat Costa Rica 1-0, and then they used the weather to their advantage, with Kyle Larin scoring a brace or 2 goals to beat Mexico to win. Then they went to Honduras and beat them 2-0, thankfully. Then they hosted the Americans in Hamilton at Tim Hortons and somehow, in some freaking way, Canada shut down the States 2-0. Canada then would beat El Salvador 2-0, and all Canada practically needed to do was get 1 point in their final games to qualify for the World Cup. They lost to Costa Rica in Costa Rica 1-0. Nevertheless, a tie against Jamaica on home turf in Toronto at BMO would have gotten Canada in. And wouldn't you know it, 4 goals past Jamaican goalkeeper Donovan Ricketts. I think that was his name. Jamaica, a good goalie. I think he played for Philly. Canada would lose to Panama, but it didn't freaking matter. What's even more crazy was if you look at the stats, Canada actually ended up winning the thing with 28 points. They tied Mexico, but because of goal differential, Canada had the best mark. It didn't really help in the draw. But, I mean, when you get ahead of Mexico and the United States, I was hoping for top 3 because top 3 teams moved on to the World Cup. So Canada, Mexico, United States, well, going. They're in. Costa Rica went to the Interconfederation playoffs. I think they won, didn't they? I think they did. I think Costa Rica won. But nevertheless. So Canada was drawn in Qatar with Morocco, Croatia, and Belgium. Canada was doomed. I thought, oh, we're fucked. Croatia, the 2018 champion, runners-up. Belgium, well, those guys are overachieve or underachieve, whatever you want to call it. And Morocco, kind of a dark horse. I predicted that we can beat Morocco, tie Croatia, lose to Belgium. So I'm thinking 1-1-1. That should be decent enough. Unfortunately, though, I was wrong. Canada would go to face Belgium, and Alphonso Davies did have a penalty in the first 17 minutes, but he missed the penalty kick. Unfortunately, though, Canada lost to Belgium 1-0. At least it was 1-0, proving how much Belgium overachieves. Then Canada would face Croatia on a Sunday. I couldn't watch that game because, church had priority. Davies in the second minute scored. Finally, Canada, after 4 matches in the World Cup, scored a goal. Beautiful. So, that was big. Unfortunately, Croatia would score 4 goals to win 4-1. Canada would face Morocco. I was thinking, well, this is the W. We're not going to make the knockout stage, but we could make a difference. Unfortunately, though, Morocco beat us 2-1. So, of course, Canada went 3-out again. 0 points, just like last time. But at least Canada scored 2 goals. Well, one was an own goal, but what the fuck? You don't matter. What's even more crazy is, as I look at the stats right now, Belgium were 1-1-1. 4 points. Belgium, again, underachieved. After Morocco and Croatia qualified for the knockout stage. But what's even more crazy is Belgium only scored 1 goal against Morocco, Croatia, and Canada. And it was us. They couldn't score against Croatia or Morocco. So Belgium, yeah, we outscored Belgium and they freaking had 4 points. We had 0. Not fair. Again. So Canada now joins El Salvador. Is it El Salvador? Or is it Honduras? I think it's El Salvador for the most World Cup games played without getting a point, and that's 0-6. So Canada has to get a point. Well, Canada, the draw was made before, the European playoffs and all that. So Canada was paired up with Qatar, Switzerland, and someone from a European qualifying pool. And wouldn't you know it, it was Italy who did not make the World Cup automatically. So they had to go face a group team. Italy would face Bosnia, and it looked like Italy was going to trounce Bosnia and, of course, beat Canada's opponent. I was anxious because I was like, oh, we're going to lose to Italy. Switzerland, we could probably tie, but we have to beat Qatar. Wouldn't you know it, freaking Bosnia won. Shocking the world. It would have been a massive game in Toronto because it would have been half Canadian fans, half Italian fans, June 12th, when Canada hosts Bosnia. Canada will play Qatar in Vancouver, and Canada on June 18th, and then June 24th, they play Switzerland in Vancouver. So basically, now that Italy got bounced by Bosnia, there is no excuse for Canada not to make the qualifying knockout stages. Of course, it's top two move on, and of course, with this being a 48-team World Cup, there will be 32. There will be 8 third-place teams. Canada must score. Like I said, I was thinking, okay, we'll lose to Italy, we'll tie Switzerland, and beat Qatar. 4 points. We should be okay. So now Canada with Bosnia, Qatar, and Switzerland, there's no excuses whatsoever. And all that. None. Zilch. Nada. You get the point. So anyway, I know it was a long-winded video, but I wanted to give the qualification thing. Of course, bias, I'm Canadian. So we'll talk about a few other nations and their World Cup status next time. I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.